Last week, as we talked about the storehouse, we looked at the foundation of the idea of tithe and offering. And our objective is to be able to talk about, well, what is the purpose of it, the meaning? Is it really applicable for Christians today? In fact, there are some churches and some ministers who have shared that tithing is not scripturally based in the New Testament. And so that we don't need to tithe. That's a part of the Mosaic law, part of the ceremonial law and the covenant that was made between Israel and between Jehovah in the Old Testament, so it is not a new dispensation thing. It's not a requirement. We can if we want, or we may choose not to, but it is more based in terms of offering based in the New Testament. Of course, we'll look at that as well. So one question that inevitably comes up when you talk about tithe and offering is that some people say, well, what about an emergency? Right? If I'm in an emergency and I'm not necessarily mishandling my affairs and my money, but things are tight right now. It's like between PG&E and between God, between a bill and between God. What do I do? What should I do in that particular instance? Can I use my tithe for that? I need to eat versus not having anything. Maybe I need medicine, and I don't have the resources to do both. And I'm not like just carelessly using money. As I'm on a budget, I'm using it and like watching every penny, but it just isn't enough. What do I do? What does the scripture say on that? So we'll talk about that as well. So it's one piece I'd certainly like to cover. But when we talk about, again, the storehouse part 2, I want to go back to a couple of pieces we looked at and conceptualize in your minds, of course, anciently what the storehouse was. Because we, meaning many Christians today, fixate off of Malachi chapter 3, that says, bring ye all the tithe into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord, if I'll not open you up the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. And we talk about then the storehouse, typically speaking, when that is shared, then many would then say, well, the storehouse is either the church that you're in or the storehouse is the local conference. And so as it relates to the organization of the SDA church, say, well, the storehouse is the conference. So that's the process of going to the storehouse. Now, when Malachi is speaking of this, there is no, quote, conference. And then we also want to consider, well, what is he talking about? The storehouse. The storehouse was literally a room. It was a room that they would devote and they would store the tithe and the offerings that would come in. Because Israel was a part of an agrarian society, it was not like money that was flowing in into the treasury as such. In the days of Malachi wrote, people would trade. They would have their horses, their cows, their sheep, their lambs, their donkeys, their vegetables, whether it's your artichokes or beets or whatever the case may be. They had all these different things. They had their wheats, they had their wine, grapes, olive oils, various alcohol. These were the commodities that they would trade in. So as they would come to the concept of it coming into a storehouse, then it would be, this is where these things were stored, right? To be dispersed amongst the Levites, to be used by them, for them, and depending upon the season, possibly to be used for the widows and the orphans as well. You recall that when we looked at the first instance of tithe, we saw it in the book of Genesis chapter 14, when Abraham returned tithe to Melchizedek after the capturing of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. They had been captured. Abraham assembled several hundred of his men. They went out, they fought them, they brought them back. And when they bring them back, they met Melchizedek, who was a priest of the Most High God. He was also a king of Salem. And it's important also to be able to consider this because Melchizedek is not a Hebrew. Like Abraham would be the father of the Jewish race, but Melchizedek is priest of Salem. And when Abraham sees him, he offers to him tithe. He returns to him a tithe of what he has gained. And the tithe in the Hebrew, of course, is referring back to a tenth. He devoted a tenth of the spoils back to him. It was as a gift. Also, we saw then in Genesis chapter 28 that Jacob covenants with God that if God is faithful to him, that if God blesses him, so that he is able to come back to his father's house, and that if he provides for him his food, his lodging, and all these things that he needs to be able to survive, then Jacob said, I'm going to give you a tithe. I will devote to you a tithe of all that I possess. Then we saw then in Numbers and Leviticus that the tithe had several, or was referenced several different ways. The first one we talked about when was a tithe that was given then as a part of on an annual basis, that it was devoted to the Levites. And this was like what we would consider like the first tithe. And so this first tithe was devoted to the Levites. It was to be given to them, and the Levites were to use it. And we saw that they received it because they were the priests of Israel. This is what they were given to be able to compensate them, and they were given this yearly. And again, people were not going around with dollar bills. They're not going around with silver and gold. In Israel, they would have all of these grains and livestock. So they would bring these things, and they would be consecrated to God, and thus given to the Levite. As it came to gathering in the animals, the book of Leviticus says, like the 10th one shall be holy unto the Lord. And so the way that the ancients would do it is they would gather up all the newborn animals, and they would corral them in a place, have the mothers on one side, and all basically the newborn animals in one pasture. So the lambs would come out, and all of them as they would come out just confined into like one exit way. And when the 10th one would come out, then they would take some red, essentially like red blood or paint, and dot it. And that 10th one belonged to the Lord. So whether it was like a big one, whether it was a small one, whether it was sickly, whether it was healthy, it didn't matter. That 10th one, it belonged to God. So then they would be able to separate that and carry back, and they would give that to him. So the tithe then was a part of the inheritance of Levi. Again, they did not receive land in Palestine. The other tribes did. They did not. They received no inheritance, and so the tithe was to be able to supply them so that they would have a way to survive. Others had land. They could grow things. They could farm. They could shepherd. Levi had nothing. And so Levi was not to be destitute, walking around saying, hey, Reuben, can you give me something? Judah, could you offer me something? But the tribes returned tithe, and this was the way of being able to support them in their service. We saw the second tithe also was mentioned. In the second tithe, that this was like a yearly celebration that would take place. In the feast that would happen, this was something that the families ate with the Levites. Deuteronomy and Numbers speak of this second tithe, and the idea there was that they would gather in all the grains at the end of the year, then they would devote a tithe. And the Bible said in the book of Deuteronomy that when they would go forth to the place where God would sanctify, that they could sell their wares, their grain and so forth. And essentially selling it, then they would have the means in hand. And when they got to the place that God had devoted, then they would go back and they could buy whatever they wanted. That was in Deuteronomy chapter 14. So they could buy then, if they wanted to eat bulls, they could buy bulls. If they wanted sheep, they could buy sheep. If they wanted grain, they buy grain. It says to buy oil, alcohol, or it says wine in the King James Version. But that was the equivalent. So they would go back and they would buy whatever they want. They would sit down, and it would be a feast that they would have their families and with the Levites. So that was the second piece that we saw. And then we saw then what is sometimes referred to as like a poor tithe or like a charity tithe. And this third tithe was taken in the third year. So every 3 years it would come up. And this third tithe would be used to take care of the Levites, but it was also provided to be used locally for those that were at the gates. like the poor, the widows, and the orphans, they were taken into consideration. The sojourners, the travelers, they would be able to share in this. So if you keep in math and looking at it, then we know then that the tithe represents a tenth. So if on an annual basis, God required of them a tithe in the covenant that they were entering into with him, that was 10% of what their net increase was. Again, not the gross. We talked about the gross versus the net, but it was the net. What was the net increase that they had? So if they had 2 lambs and 1 lamb, and male and female, they had an offspring. Well, the increase is 1. Right? And then the following year, if they have added 1 more, it's the difference between the net increase. And that was what they would render a tithe on, of what God had blessed them with to be able to grow from. This is what we had, and this is what we have now. The other question that sometimes comes up, and we'll not talk about it extensively, but some people say, well, do I tithe off of the gross and net? If I'm tithing, do I give off of my gross, or do I give off of the net? And the scripture says again, in that respect, it was the net that the increase was off of. But again, people may choose and do either way. There's some implications if you go gross, some implications of net, but we have talked about that previously. The idea behind it all, though, was that God was sovereign. It was communicating his love for his people and also communicating his care for them. And it also was their trust in him. For they are returning to the Lord 10% of their increase every year. That's in the first tithe. Then there was a second tithe that would come through, and that they would also return 10%. So if you're doing the math, then 10% plus 10% is 20%. So they're returning 20% of their increase every year to Jehovah. And then the third year would roll around. So year 1 would be 20% that they were returning. Year 2 was 20% they were returning. Year 3 was 20% plus 10%. So we're at 30% that they would return to Jehovah in the third year in tithe and this relationship that they bore with him. So if you average it out, most will come to about 23 to 25% a year. That was their annual contribution in tithe and offering. Some estimate even maybe it's 30%, you can see, of course, in the year, but 25 to 30% is what they were returning in tithe and an offering. So all this that they were giving and they were returning, why? It was a symbol of the covenant and their response to Jehovah. Well, what about the storehouse then? So let's pivot over into the storehouse in 2 Chronicles chapter 31. So I think we can clearly again see Old Testament. Clearly we know that they were returning a tithe, and the tithes accumulated about 25%. That doesn't include offering. All right. So basis of tithe, and if you want to put in the umbrella that offering as such was the second tithe and so forth, let's just call it 25 to 30% is what they were doing. Now, where is all this going? In 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verse 6, it says, concerning the children of Israel and Judah that dwelt in the cities of Judah, that they also brought the tithe of oxen and sheep and the tithe of holy things, which were considered consecrated to the Lord their God, and they laid them by heaps. All right, this is going in so forth, 2 Chronicles 31. They're laying the tithe by heaps. Now, Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 38 says, and the priests, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites, and when the Levites take tithes. And the Levites shall bring up the tithe of the tithes into the house of our God, to the chambers and to the treasure house. So the Levites, even when they receive tithe, they also return tithe. So they tithe on the tithe. Right? So they would, in essence, return 10% of what they received as well. That would go forth to the temple. Now it says in this verse 38 that they returned the tithe into the house of our God, to the chambers and to the treasure house. Nehemiah chapter 10 and verse 38. Now consider Nehemiah 13 and 12. Then brought all Judah the tithe of the corn and the new wine and the oil into the treasuries. So in Nehemiah's day, he's talking about them bringing in the tithe of the wine, of the oil and of the corn, and is going into the chambers, or is going into the treasure house. At this point, of course, the treasure house that he would be referring to would be the temple that had been built. So prior to this then, the storehouses that were seen were in effect the local areas where they lived, where they dwelt. Now, as God is establishing a place in Jerusalem that would ultimately be the temple, then they are bringing forth their tithe there. Now we come to this text in Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. As always, it's important to be able to look at like the backdrop of what's setting up this particular case in Malachi chapter 3. Malachi 3, verse 8, it asks the question, says, will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me in tithe and offering. Why is he saying that they have robbed him in tithe and offering? In the day in which Malachi, of course, is writing, it would be equivalent and important for us to be able to look and to see the other minor prophets and what's taking place as well. What is happening? God is seeking through the instrumentality of Nehemiah, through Ezra and others, to restore and to build Jerusalem. You remember what had happened to what had the Babylonians done when they had come to conquer Jerusalem in 605? They had destroyed the temple. Right? The temple had been destroyed. They didn't have a place of being able to worship. 70 years later, the decree goes forth that they're to go back and they can restore Jerusalem. As they go in and they begin to work to build Jerusalem, they have like a twofold task. They need to have a temple that they want to build, but they also need a place for them to live themselves. Like they're going back into this war-torn area. Where are they going to live? How will they survive? Now, while they have been gone, an interesting thing has happened to the land. Another group of individuals has come into land as well. You read about it in the book of Chronicles, the group that we call the Samaritans. They've come into the land. Part of what Nebuchadnezzar did when he would conquer countries, he would bring in essentially people from other nations, and they would live there. So it was not like an indigenous people anymore, but it was a collective group of people who had come in. So we have the Samaritans who are living there as well. So you have Israelites coming back home, and you have Samaritans who are here. And you recall in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah's story that created like a rift between them, right? Because they said, well, look, help us to build the temple. And they said, we don't want your help. We'll build the temple on our own. And it created this further divide. And so then the Samaritans were trying to get the privileges that had been conferred upon Israel deferred, taken away from them. And they began to write letters saying, hey, you know that these folks, once they build the walls, they're going to turn and revolt against you. All during this time, the temples, by and large, the work has ceased on building the temple. Hosea and others start saying, look, is it time for you to build your own houses and that the house of God lay desolate? Because if you're saying that we don't have the resources, and how can you find the resources to build your house, but you can't find the resources to build God's house? It's the same as saying, I'm broke, I don't have any money to do anything. I can't give an offering of $1 to the Lord. And that very next breath, someone says, well, hey, there's a sale at Pizza Hut. You buy 2 pizzas for $25 and you get an extra 3. Oh, I got the money for that. That's the context of what's taking place in Malachi, right? This is what he is saying. He is saying, will a man rob God? And the inference is that it is not that you are destitute. It is not that you do not have. It's rather you are choosing not to. It is one thing if I have and and I choose not to give. It's nothing if I do not have and I desire to give. But in this case, in Malachi, saying, look, you have the resources to do it, but you're just choosing not to. I'm not important enough for you to do this. You don't love me enough that you want to do something. Some people say, well, is God equating love to gifts? No, it's not equating love to gifts in that respect. I'm using that sort of loosely. But I am equating it to the context of their obedience unto him. Because part of the covenant that they were in was that they were saying, God, as you bless me, I'm going to return and bless you. So he's saying, I have blessed you, but you haven't come back and blessed me. And certainly not that he needs their tithe, not that he needs their offering, but it's a part of that covenant relationship that he is in with them. So it says in Malachi 3, will a man rob God? It says, yet ye have robbed me. Yet ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? And it says, you robbed me in tithe and offerings. Now, again, this text again lets us know that they had the resources to be able to do so, but they chose not to do so. How so? Because offerings were always, in the context of the Old Testament, free will. So understand it and view it as such, that the 10% for tithe, in the context as we specifically address in the Old Testament, that was compulsory. It was mandatory. They were obligated to do it. Now, they had free will, free choice to do so, so that is not what I'm not suggesting. But as an entry into the covenant that with him, they are committed to 10%, right? They're on the hook for 10%. And that 10% was of their increase. Offerings, on the other hand, were not compulsory. They were voluntary, as the Lord hath prospered them. Thus, they are choosing to withhold both, simply because it is not convenient for them. And when we withhold from God, not, quote, tithe and offering, but anything in life, because it is not convenient for us, we rob ourselves of a blessing. Please don't hone in on tithe and offering, but in life, whenever he's asking us, whenever he calls us, whenever he bids us, and we say, no, it's not for me to do, we rob ourselves. We're not hurting him. He is saying, I don't need your tithe and offering. If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you. I have a cattle upon 1,000 hills. You are cursed with a curse. How are they cursed with a curse? Simply because they are choosing to step out of his favor. They are exposed to the enemy. So please don't understand it as punitive. If you don't do this, I'm going to do this to you. Like if you don't go to your room, I'm going to give you a spanking. This is not punitive. It is simply saying, look, part of the covenant, part of the blessing that you're in as believers is encapsulated in the concept of ownership. And that's really what is driving home to stewardship as ownership. Like Deuteronomy says that when you go into the land and you begin to be prospered, don't forget about the one who has prospered you. So that would be like modernizing for us when we're looking for work and we're praying, Lord, bless me with the job and I want to be able to return to you. Then it's Deuteronomy 8 is saying God is the one that gives us the health. God is the one that gives us the strength. He's the one that gives us the opportunity. And then when we get the job, we're like, okay, well, thank you so much, Lord. You've blessed, you've answered my prayer. I have it. And then the thought comes, well, then should I return tithe and offering? It's like, well, I got this job myself. Well, I'm not going to return. Maybe, I'll check and see, and I'll get back on that one. And we withdraw ourselves from the blessing and the favor. It's like Job talks about like as a hedge. Like God sets a hedge then of favor and a hedge of blessing, and we can't buy our way into it. All right? No amount of gifts, no amount of tithe, no amount of offerings can buy us into favor. It is simply the surrendering of the heart and of the will and of the life. We receive the divine favor from God. But when that is removed, he says, and you are now cursed with a curse. For ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring ye all the tithe into the storehouse, so there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts. If I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room to receive it. So now again, he's correcting the action, saying, I want you to bring all the tithe into the storehouse. All right, bring the tithe into the storehouse. Now we talked about this already, so we know again that the storehouse was a place that they, would put the tithe, whether it was grain, whether it was olive oil, whether it was wine. All those things will go into the storehouse. He said, I want you to bring it back into the storehouse, that there will be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts. Like, test me, try me, and see if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. Now, modern interpretation is that if you return to the Lord tithe and offering, he is going to bless you with more tithes, with more money to give more tithes and offering. Wouldn't that be nice if that was what the text said? So where do we come up with the text says if you give God $1, he's going to give you back like $100? Did you read about or see the folks who were going to chase ATMs, and they had heard that there was a glitch in the ATM? That if you went in and you put in your ATM card, you could put in a check, and the check, like to deposit it, and it would give you back X amount of dollars. Like, so maybe you put in a check for $200, it'll let you instantly be able to take out $200, and even if the check, wasn't good, you could get the money out. And the police were driving by in one instance, and they saw people there, like a line of people with hoodies on and their hood pulled over their faces, so as not to be identified. And I think of that and I chuckle because in order to be able to access the ATM, if you've used one, you have to use your own ATM unless you stole someone's card, their PIN number. All right, so here we have some folks who are not thinking too straight, who are using their own ATM card, depositing a check into their own account, because you're not depositing into someone else's account when you're using your own ATM, it's affixed to yours, depositing it and saying the check is worth, $3,000, but there's a, immediate release of funds of $600, and they feel that they're getting away with something. It's like Dumb and Dumber. How dumb can you be? This is all in your account. You video record it. You're going to have to pay this back, but they feel that they're getting away with it. They're just walking like, hey, free money, free money. Because they didn't understand, right? When Malachi says, prove me, God is literally asking us to test him. Because stewardship is a level of ownership. Whose does it rightly belong to? If it's mine, I can give as I please. I have say-so and how it shall be used, how it will be governed. If it is not mine, I don't have say-so in that. I have no say-so in how you run affairs in your house. because I don't contribute to your house. So it would be out of line for me to come in to say, this is how you should do things in your house. You'll look at me as though, thank you, but no thank you. Prove me, test me, try me, and see if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing that there shall not be room enough to receive. What he has promised, he's promised a blessing. But we read that as he has promised a specific thing. It simply says, I'm going to give you a blessing. Doesn't mean I'm going to give you back $2, like the people trying to use at the ATM, like, okay, I'll keep doing this all day long. But you know what's a blessing? When you got to scratch your head this morning, like move your hand and scratch your head, that was a blessing. No, you know it was a blessing when you woke up and you were in a bed. It was a blessing when you looked up and there was, a ceiling. There was a blessing to look out and you were able to see. It was a blessing to be able to hear the birds. The blessing to be able to, when it was time to sit up and you were able to sit up. It's a blessing to be able to jump into. All these different things are like blessings, and we read it as literally as if you return tithe and offering, then God's going to bless me with money. And many religious leaders and evangelists and teachers will state that if you bless God, try God, test Him. And there have been folks who should not have given, but have been felt forced to give, all because people say, well, you try God, God's going to bless you with X amount. And it doesn't say that. It just simply says that He will pour you out a blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. So what is this storehouse then, going back to this? This is Nehemiah 13, verses 3 through verse 12. It says, it came to pass that when they had heard the law, they had separated from Israel all the mixed multitude, and before this, Eliashib the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied unto Tobiah. And he had prepared for him a great chamber, where aforetime they laid the meat offerings, the frankincense, and the vessels and the tithe of the corn, the new wine, and the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites, and the singers and the porters, and the offerings of the priests. And so let me just stop here to highlight a couple of pieces really quick, then to go forward. One is that the storehouse is being occupied by Tobiah. Like the room that should have the grains and the corn and the wine and the oil has been renovated. And Tobiah is living in there. Who is Tobiah? He is like an avowed enemy of the Jews, of Israel, seeking to rebuild the temple. This is God's house, and they're seeking to work, but it says that the storehouse, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is what it says. It says that he prepared for him a great chamber where aforetime they laid the meat offerings. And so again, you can conclude and see again that the chamber that they prepare is like, we don't have anywhere else. Oh, you know what? Hey, you know what? There's a room here that we use for tithe and offering. You can make that your bedroom. The other thing to note is that later on, the tithe and the offerings, it would also be used in support of those who ministered in the sanctuary, like singers and porters. But in all this was I not at Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I came into the king, and certain obtained leave of the king. And so I came to Jerusalem, and I understood of the evil that Eliashib did for Tobiah in preparing a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And it grieved me sore that therefore I cast forth all of his stuff out of the chamber. And I commanded, and they cleansed the chamber, and therefore they brought in again the vessels of the house of God with the meat offerings and the frankincense. And I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, for the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled, everyone to his field. Then I contended with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? I gathered them together and set them in their place, and then I brought all Judah, the tithe of the corn and the new wine and of the oil into the treasury. So we can see then that the treasury that he's referring back to now, he has restored back in Jerusalem. And so this is where these things are after he has cleansed them. So let's quickly recap then. We can find then in the Old Testament that the treasury was in Jerusalem. It eventually would become in Jerusalem. That was where they were devoting. They would store the grain, wine to be distributed. Keep in mind that this was only one temple, so it was designated there as such. Now, the question that we would also understand is that this would not be the, quote, exclusive storehouse. Because we've already read that the third year, what were they doing with the tithe that was there? They were gathering it, they were using it at the gate where they were. So it was being used locally there as well. So as the system of tithe and offerings brought into the New Testament church. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 9 through verse 14. For it is written in the law of Moses that thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care for his oxen, or saith he altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, it is a great thing if we shall reap unto you carnal things. If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. And do not ye know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers of the altar? Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Now, in the New Testament, tithe is mentioned a couple of times. You see references to it in scriptures like this, but you don't see like explicit statement in saying tithe is a New Testament or tithing is done in the early church. We don't see that explicitly being brought about. Okay? But what we do see, though, is that Paul is making the argument, it is referring back to Moses about the ox that's treading the corn. If the ox needs to be free, you don't muzzle him while he's working in the corn. Let him eat some. Like, he might eat a piece here and a piece there, but he's doing all this work. Let him eat. And his argument is that, well, those that are ministering about spiritual things, they should be compensated by secular things. Or that just because they are preaching the gospel doesn't mean that God's going to like open up the windows of heaven and send out a raven to feed them. They need physical things to sustain them as they minister about spiritually. So, of course, this will certainly refer us back to the system then of tithing and offering. You can also reference, and you will read Matthew chapter 23. In 23, Jesus made reference to it. He said that you are tithing off of mint, anise, and cumin. But you've omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. And these you should have done, but not to have left the others undone. So in other words, he is not dismissing the system of tithing. He's saying you've tithed very scrupulously. But you haven't shown mercy, you haven't shown judgment, you haven't shown favor. One you should have done, but the other one not to have left undone. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 17, Paul writes that let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those that labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture saith that thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his hire. So the New Testament shows us then that, again, not explicitly, but we're able to deduce then that the system of tithing and offering was brought into the New Testament church as well. So how does that then relate then to modern day as such? Paul's writing then is certainly applicable for modern day, but the church, after, of course, the death of the apostles, and you start reading in the first century and the second century and so forth, it's interesting that there were some church fathers who did not espouse tithe, and there were some who did. So some believe that you should tithe, and some believe you shouldn't, because again, it wasn't explicitly stated in the New Testament. So if you kind of fast forward things as they continue to happen, we start seeing the organized system of tithe coming about during the time of the medieval church. As the church has been dispersed and gone throughout various regions, and different groups of meeting and fellowshipping and so forth. Coming into the dark ages, of course, and coming out, the church, it becomes really transformed. And you begin to have like organized churches and so forth in different areas. And then that's just when you start seeing then the reintroduction, if you please, of tithe and offering in terms of the church. And what happens in that? Well, it's necessary because you need to support the priest, you need to support the function and the structure of the church, and all of these things are important to happen. Again, that does not make it unscriptural, but it just reminds us and shows us again how it would be. The Philippian church I did not mention, but you can read that in the Philippians. Paul wrote to them and said that they had supported them financially. So I'll share that text to state then again that we can see in the early church then that sometimes the churches would support the apostles. And Paul said this, you have helped me out really several times, and others should have been able to give and to support. Now I want to begin to wrap up and to share a couple of things though, before maybe any questions. I mentioned in the medieval church, then you start seeing again like the reintroduction of tithe and offering, and really like a central place. We're going to bring back offering, and so the concept of storehouse starts appearing during this time. Doesn't make it evil, just history. Okay. When we relate and when we go into the rise in the teaching of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you may be surprised to know that for probably the first 20 years, tithing did not exist. Like today, the church teaches tithe and offering. Not so when it was founded. When it was founded, it was just basically people give whatever you could give. It was an offering. And then they developed a system that was called Sister Betsy. And that was an organized attempt to be able to have like specific benchmarks to give. And so it would be like for a male to age 20 to age 40 might give 2 cents or 3 cents a month. And a female of this age to this age might give something. It was, again, not a system that was based off of tithe and offering. It was just more of an assessment of age tier and a contribution based on that. It would shift again and would be based off of a estimation of value of property so that everyone would give something. And we're not being to the 1870s and to the idea then of tithing to be set apart that would be introduced of where you hold 10% from the word tithe in the New Testament. So not into the 1870s. And that was done, of course, to be able to help to facilitate and to help to spur the growth of the church so that everyone then would have an opportunity of being able to support to give, again, 10% to whatever one would have. Now, in the whole system of tithe and offering, I do want to highlight Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and to tie it back to the question, one of the questions that, well, should I give if I am financially strapped? Like if I don't have the money and I'm financially strapped, should I give? Because after all, God doesn't need my tithe and offering. And you are 100% correct. God does not need our tithe and offering. But we forgot about the other part of the equation. But we need God's blessing. And God's blessing comes as a result of surrendering our lives, of seeking to follow Him. So should I return tithe and offering if I don't have it or in a dire circumstance? Well, two things I want you to consider. First one, Romans chapter 14 and verse 23. I don't have it on the screen, but you can reference it. You can look it up. Romans chapter 14 and verse 23. It's a principle to draw in mind. What does he say? Romans 14 and verse 23. Paul says that whatsoever, first part, that he that doubts is damned if he eat, because he does not eat in faith. For whatsoever is not in faith is sin. Okay? That's Romans 14 and verse 23. That whatever is not in faith is sin. So, if I'm in a financial situation and I know or feel in my spirit that I should return tithe and offering, and I'm being challenged with it, and if I don't simply consider this verse in conjunction with the next verse, I may be in a problem. Now, this verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 says that he that sows sparingly will reap sparingly, and he which sows bountifully shall reap bountifully. So that does not mean, let me go and give a lot then, and then God's going to bless me a lot. That's not what that is saying. It's not saying then that if I give a little bit, God's going to bless me a little bit. It's not what it's saying. It's saying that if I sow sparingly, meaning if I continue to minister in a small manner, I only plant 4 seeds. I'm only going to receive like crop from those 4 seeds. But if I put in 25, then I'm going to receive benefit from that 25. The crux of the text says that every man, according as he purpose in his heart, let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, but God loves a cheerful giver. So we'll bring that into practically speaking. God is not going to be upset if a person does not, quote unquote, return their tithe and offering. Nor will he be upset if a person did something else. That said, though, whatever is not of faith is sin. If I take that X amount of dollars, whatever it is, and I don't want to give it, but it's my tithe, and I feel compelled to do so, and I give anyway, but my spirit isn't right, we miss the whole point of the blessing. I should have just kept it and paid the bill and moved on. If I gave it for the wrong purpose, I should have just gone on and taken care of that. So it's like if I took it, I needed some tires, and the money that I was going to return in tithe, it's the exact same amount of money that I need to be able to use to get new tires. And my tires are bought, and I go and give, and I'm like, okay, well, God, you're going to bless me to get some new tires. And I'm cursing God out because the following week, the tires blew, and I don't have any tires. We missed the whole point. Whatever isn't of faith is sin. God loves a cheerful giver. Now, to answer the question, does he require and does he expect us to return back to him our tithe? Yes, he does. But the point I want to lean into is that he's not so much concerned about what's in the envelope, but the spirit that is inspiring the gift. And so I can give it and be technically correct that, okay, I didn't, quote, rob God, but I have the wrong spirit. Well, I might as well just should have gone and used it otherwise. Because that is not the spirit that he desires me to give and to operate in. You see, he is in an abundant spirit, and as we give, it helps us to become more like him and less like ourselves. That introduces an area of being able to trust him. Lord, I'm going to trust you because I really am struggling, because I could use this money to get my tires fixed, but I will claim the promise of your word. I don't know that you will provide me 4 brand new tires, but I'm going to trust you just to be able to work the situation out. So help me not to have a begrudging spirit that as I give it, and like begrudging is like, okay, I'm giving it, but I don't want to let loose of it. It's like, like a tug of war. That's what like giving grudgingly is. I don't want to, but I feel forced to. Like I don't want you to give off of sympathy. I don't want you to give off of pity. I want you to forgive off of fear. I want you to give because your heart is in the right place. I want you to give because you love me. You recognize that I'm the one who has given you all these different things, and you are seeking in an act of devotion, an act of worship to honor me. That is what I desire. That is what I want. He loves then a cheerful giver. Let me read this last statement to you in closing. And this is from, this is volume 3 of the Testimonies, page 4. Now I'm going to read just two pieces of it. One piece, because one thing, there is the opportunity of a person giving too much. Now you probably don't hear that too much. It talks about, quote, tithe and offering, but yes, let's consider that. It says, God has been robbed in tithe and offering. It is a fearful thing to be guilty of withholding from the treasury of robbing God. Ministers who preach the word at our large gatherings feel the sinfulness of neglecting to render to God the things that are His. They know that God will not bless His people while they are disregarding His plan of benevolence. They seek to arouse the people to their duty by pointed practical discourses, showing the danger and sinfulness of selfishness and covetousness. Conviction fastens upon minds, and the icy chill of selfishness is broken. And when the call is made for donations to the cause of God, some, under the steering influence of the meetings, are aroused to give who otherwise would do nothing. As far as this class is concerned, good results have been realized. But under pressing calls, many feel the deepest who have not had their hearts frozen up with selfishness. They have conscientiously kept their means flowing out to advance the cause of God. Their whole being is stirred by the earnest appeals made, and the very ones respond who may have given all that the circumstances in life would justify. But these liberal, wholehearted believers, prompted by a zealous love for the cause and a desire to act promptly, judge themselves capable of doing more than God requires them to do, for their usefulness is crippled in other directions. These willing ones sometimes pledge to raise money when they know not from what source it is coming, and some are placed in distressing circumstances to meet their pledges. Some are obliged to sell their produce at great disadvantage, and some have actually suffered for the conveniences and necessities of life in order to meet their pledges. So very quickly, it is referring to the opportunity and the experience of some ministers going in, they're sharing, and they're teaching again on the system of benevolence. Not tithe and offering, but benevolence at that point was like that Sister Betsy plan. And some would hear, and they hadn't participated in giving. They've been robbing God and, quote, tithe and offering. And their hearts are moved to say, okay, well, you know what? I will give something now because I have defrauded, I have robbed Him for so long. Simultaneously, then an appeal goes out, and there are some that are there who have given faithfully as they have been able to, when they hear about the cause needing something. And they say, I want to give, I want to do something to be able to assist that. And this class has put themselves out, well, we would say, on a limb. They want to do more. And notice it says, and the reason why they put them on a limb is that there are these willing ones sometimes pledge to raise money when they know not from what source it is coming. And some are placed in distressing circumstances to meet their pledges. So I'm going to commit, and I'm going to give X to this cause that's here. And they put themselves over on a limb. God does not require that. They are put in a situation where then, in order to be able to meet the pledge, they are put in unfavorable circumstances. So now I maybe have to go and to sell this to be able to fulfill that. May have to give away this to be able to get this, and so at a loss to be able to honor what I have said, when again that is not the case. It concludes, it says, there was a time at the commencement of our work when such sacrifice would have been justified, when God would have blessed all those who thus ventured out to do for His cause. The friends of truth were few and their means very limited, but the work has been widening and strengthening until there is means enough in all the hands of the believers to amply sustain the work in its all departments without embarrassing any, if all would bear their proportional part. The cause of God need not be crippled in the slightest degree. The precious truth that has been made so plain that many have taken hold of it, and their hands means which God has entrusted to them to use in advancing the interests of the truth. If these men of means do their duty, there need not be a pressure brought upon the poor brethren. All have an opportunity to be able to support, and all have an opportunity to be able to give, but it was interesting that some will put themselves in precarious situations to be able to advance the cause. And what he is then saying is that it is not a burden that rests upon one, but it's a responsibility and a burden that rests upon many, that rests upon all to be able to advance. Because ultimately, Matthew 6:21, it says, and then wherever our treasure is, there our heart will be also. If it's a burden for us, and it's important for us, it will be important for him, and he will bless us. So the question then we answer then in the storehouse, well, where is it? We've seen in Scripture then that there was not a particularly designated place. At different times and intervals, it may have changed. Not may have, it did. We also see that in supporting and the giving then the tithe, that had a specific purpose, a particular function that it was being used for. And ultimately, we recognize again that God is after the attitude of the heart. Not after a particular amount, but of the heart. He wants 100% of the heart. If he can have the 100% of the heart, everything else will work itself out. Lord, we thank you for being with us. I pray that you would help us to give you all of our hearts, all of our minds, our lives, and our souls. Sometimes we are selfish and we look to these earthly things and we feel that if we give, then we will not have. Help us to see that in giving to you, we will never be put at a loss. That in being in covenant relationship with you, that you've promised that you will bless us. Thank you for helping us to see that the blessing is not always monetary, but the blessings come in so many different ways. And we thank you so much that you have blessed us. We thank you that you have kept us. I pray that you would help us to be better stewards of all the gifts that you've given and entrusted into our care. We thank you again for your mercy. We thank you once more for your grace. In Jesus' name, amen.